We're going to start out by going through some of the more basic functions of the function editor. And we're going to start out by using material for this. So I'm just going to load in a sphere just by clicking on that sphere icon on the left. And we can double click on our surface over here, which will bring up the advanced material editor. If you're on the basic material editor, which is going to look like this, you want to make sure you click on that advanced material editor button. And now what we can do is access the function editor in any of these tabs, or at least the majority of them, just by right mouse clicking on a preview and going to edit function. What we can also do is extract specific parameters for a lot of these different settings, and we'll be taking a look at that a little more in depth later. So I'm going to right mouse click and go to edit function, and that's going to bring up our function editor along with our default function that we have for this surface. And I have a couple of windows open right now that you may or may not have open. And what we have is the function output observer and our function node preview. The output observer gives us an exact representation of what our surface is going to look like, and in this case it's showing it on a sphere. If we take a look at the function node preview, right now we're just going to see some flat lines, but once we start modifying different functions, we'll see a very nice graph view to be able to determine certain aspects of our nodes for each of the different axes. And we can also set our scale for this, and also the position and origin points of each of these axes. But we'll be taking a look at that a little bit later, and you'll see that update as we're working on different areas. What we can do is right mouse click, and we can drag around our view for our function. If we take a look at the top, you can see we have a lot of different settings. If we take a look at some of our navigation options that we have, we can zoom in and out, and now we can see those functions a little bit larger and those nodes a little bit bigger. We can zoom that back out. We can also use the other magnifier if we want to drag out an area and just sort of frame something more specific. And of course there is an extent to which we can zoom in. So if we take a look right now, keep hitting that plus sign, we're going to see that we're at the max zoom, and I can zoom that back out. If we go back and select this area over here, and now we can see that showing up. What we also have is a frame, so we can click on that, and that's going to frame our entire function that we're working on. So if you get off track and you're off at the function, you can't seem to find your nodes, you can just frame it and basically frame our selected items as well, because if we click with our left mouse button and drag over, we can select specific items, and then we can always frame that as well. So there's a lot we can do with this. Also on the top we have an undo and redo function and different settings depending on what we're working on. And typically you want to use these buttons rather than Control Z, which you would normally use for an undo, and it usually works a lot better if we just select these different buttons on the top. You can also see right now we have some grayed out areas, but if I select one of our nodes, we can see we have the ability to cut, copy, and paste, and that way we can use similar nodes over and over again for connecting different functions. We can also copy those and paste those into other settings, so if you're working on a terrain and you had one specific node, you could copy it and paste it in for your material so that things match up. And we'll be taking a look at that a little bit later. If we go over here to the left where we have our first two buttons, this first one is going to be show parameters. And right now, because of the type of node we have, we're not really going to see that. So let's go ahead and change out our top node, which is currently a constant node. And for this default surface, we have the color map on the bottom, which we have the ability to create a gradient for. This is running into a filter, and then the top is our constant node. And the constant node right now is more of something that is meant to be replaced. It's just kind of there by default. And what we can do is first add in just a fractal node, and with it selected we can go over to the left and we're going to select our fractal node button, and now we have a simple fractal added in to replace that constant node. And that's going to determine exactly how this color map is going to show up. Of course right now it's only one color all the way through, so you really can't see that. But we can now see those parameters on the side. If we go ahead and zoom in, we can see all of the different options that are available. And if we take a look at the bottom and all the options for our fractal node, you can see we have the wavelength, the origin, the largest feature, smallest feature, roughness, gain, and all of these parameters can be extracted. And we can either extract them by just clicking on a little button we have there, and now we have a constant node that is attached to that side, or we can directly connect each of these variables by showing our parameters on the side. So that way if we wanted to connect something directly, all we need to do is pull that out, and we don't need to worry about extracting the parameter and then replacing the constant node. So it can be a much easier way of working. If you leave your mouse over it and let it hover, we can see each of those parameters where we have the wavelength, origin, largest feature, all the way down to the max, which is going to be part of our filtering, which is the creep in, min, and max amount. If we take a look, we can see those on the bottom, and I'll just let that hover. You can see the max, the min, and then that creep in value. Currently these are grayed out because our filter is set to the default. If I was to change this, which we can easily do, and what I'm going to do is just change that to a curve and click OK. Now we can see that the creep in, the min, and the max value of this filter has shown up. And we're going to go into that a little bit later in actually modifying our filters. You also notice too that our parameters have sort of disappeared, and that can happen sometimes. And the easiest way to get those parameters back is just to kind of move your node. And now you can see all of those are back, and we can connect them to whatever it is we need to. So I'm going to reset that filter, just right mouse click, and we get a couple of different options. We could load in filters, save these filters, copy, paste, also edit, and like I just used, reset. If we move all the way to the first button on the top left, and we go ahead and click on that, we can see we have a lot of different options. Our first is show all previews in graph. And this is what I usually use, and what this is going to do is show us a preview of every single node within our graph. If we take a look at this filter node right now, we can see that show in graph is selected and checked. If we uncheck it, we're just going to see a representation of that filter node. It just says filter, but it doesn't actually show us the effects of the filter. If we show it in graph, now we're going to be able to see what this filter is doing currently to our simple fractal. But right now it's not really doing anything. So I'm going to change that to a sine wave, and now we can see as we adjust the contrast and the brightness of this, that filter is going to be showing up, and I could turn off show in graph, and now we're not seeing that. We can also see the parameters for this sine wave for the contrast and the brightness, which means we can connect these to other nodes that we have available. We'll go ahead and turn that off for our simple fractal, and it's just an easy way to compress some of your nodes if you're working on a very large function. It can be very helpful. Typically I keep it on show all previews in graph, and that way we can see the effects of all of our filters, all of our turbulence nodes, although turbulence nodes typically stay exactly the same. And we'll get into each one of those nodes once we start creating things. We'll go back in, and we can see we also have preview only noises and colors, and that way all we're seeing is either fractal nodes, noise nodes, which I just added in, and also our color map nodes. And that way all of our filters would be compressed. So if I preview only noises and colors, we can see that filter is now no longer showing the preview. Go back, turn that on, change that back to show all previews. Or what we could also do is hide all previews, and that will compress the entire function down to the simple view, where we can see the previews by clicking on them in the lower left corner. And sometimes that can be just a little bit easier. So it really depends on the way you work, whether or not you need to compress some of these nodes, bring them down to make it a little bit cleaner, because sometimes when you're working on extremely large functions, it can get a little confusing. We can go back in here. We can also see we have show arrows on links. And I'm going to zoom in first, and we can see all of these little arrows on the ends of our links. Go ahead and turn that off, and now we're not going to see those arrows anymore. But they can be helpful because they do show the direction in which our function travels, where we have our input nodes on top, traveling through our nodes, down to our output nodes on the bottom. So right now we have position traveling to this fractal node, which goes to our filter, then to our color map, and then the output is the color. We also have our alpha connected to this color map, although currently that is not having any effect. And let's go right back into that button again, and I'm going to turn on that show arrows and links, and we also have show links as straight lines. Now right now we can see that these lines for our links are being bent and twisted to go around whichever nodes we have. We also have the ability to change that so they're only straight lines. So we can show links as straight lines, and now we can see we have the ability to overlap. And it really depends on the way you like to work, and sometimes showing as straight lines can be a little more useful because we can overlap these lines, and that way we don't have any nodes sometimes getting bounced off to the side because of the way the links are. But I'm going to turn that off right now, and then we're going to go into our preview options. We have a couple of different preview options. We have the object to be displayed, which is our actual preview of each of these nodes that we're showing in the graph. So we could set this to a cube, a cylinder, a marble, which is just a smaller sphere, cone, the sphere, which is the default, an XY plane, and also the 2D plane. So really depending on what you're working on, if you're not specifically working on a sphere-shaped object, you could change that to a cylindrical object, or a cone. It can be helpful for terrains. The XY plane is a little bit more stretched, kind of difficult to tell sometimes, so you can always switch that to the 2D plane and see that a little bit better. So it just depends on what it is you're looking to create and how you want to modify these options. We can also see we have the background type currently is set to checker. I could change that to uniform, and now we're going to see a gradient. We can set whether or not we'd like to use the local light and the lighting in the scene. And we can also change that background color, which works as a color map. So we can edit that color map, and now we see this showing up where we have our first point in the front, which is this light blue color. We could change that to more of a yellow, and now we can see that showing up. We can go to the right side, take that white color, and make that more of a blue, and click OK. And now we have sort of a yellow and a blue. If we change that to the checker, it's going to take each of those colors and make them into a checker. There won't be that gradient or fade, but it's a really nice way to be able to modify some of these settings. And if you want to, you could also just make it completely white or completely black, depending if the color is sort of screwing up your view or your preview of the object. We can also load in the color map just by right mouse clicking and getting all those different options. And when we load, it brings up our selector, and we can go through all of the gradient maps that come along with View or any of the personal ones you've created. And what we could do is go to daytime skies, and I believe one of the defaults is in here. We can go to rocks and grass, and I'll select our red, brown, yellow, click OK, and now we're going to see that showing up for our preview. Change that to the checker, and we can go back. There's a lot of different preview options, and they can become very helpful depending on what it is you're working on. I'm going to remove this noise node right now that we have selected. And we can just click on it and hit delete, and we can do that with any of these different functions, along with our links as well. So if I don't want this color map linked to our alpha, I can select that link, just hit delete, and now it's no longer connected to that alpha. If we move over to the left, and our left sidebar, we're going to be able to see all of our different nodes. First we have our input nodes, and this input node is set to position. You can go ahead and delete that. And the next one is going to be our output nodes, and we can see we have a bunch of different options for this. And right now, since we're working with materials, pretty much all of these are going to apply. We can connect to our highlight color, highlight intensity, size, value, and all of these are also available directly within the material editor. So if you don't want to have to go back and close this out, so if you click OK right now, and let's go into bump, actually we'll move to highlight. We can see that highlight color. If we want, we can extract that parameter, which will open up directly in the function editor. Or if we didn't want to have to close that out, what we could do is just delete that as if we never loaded it in, go back into our function. Actually, that's still showing up. What we can do is go to our output and select highlight color, and that way it's showing up already, and we don't need to go out of the function editor in order to add some of these values. Another really cool thing is if we right mouse click, we can see all of the different nodes that are available. So we have our input nodes, and before we added this position by clicking on that input node, go to the output nodes and we can see all the same ones we just had showing up before, and we also have our noise, fractal, color, and all the rest of the nodes that are available. So if we go back over to the left, underneath our input and output nodes, which represent the top and the bottom of our function, going from the input and traveling all the way through the output. Our first that we see is a noise node, and just underneath that is a fractal node. And I'm just going to load both of these in. And now these work a little bit differently, but they still use the same noise patterns to generate each of these different views. And I want our output observer to really show what we're working on. So the first thing I want to do is just modify some of these settings that we have for our default. And I'm going to delete that simple fractal we created before, delete our filter node. And if we go to our color map, we want to modify this so that we can actually see the variation in color. Because basically the way that each of these different nodes is going to work is the black value is going to be one side of the color map, and the white value is going to be the other side. So basically black on the left, white on the right, or vice versa. If we actually connect that, we'll be able to see exactly which colors are going to be showing up. So we can either right mouse click and go to Edit Color Map, and this way we can modify and create our own custom color map. We can just click and move around, and we can see the slider showing up and also our position changing. And then we can select New Key Color, and this will allow us to add in another color. And I'm going to select blue. If we go to the right, we can just click on that current key color that's in there. Click on the color, it will bring up our color selection. And let's select more of a red. And now we have blue fading to red. We can click OK. And now it's just showing up as a solid color because we don't have anything to control where the color is going to be. So now if we go to the top of this color map, we can select our link and now attach this directly to either our noise node or our fractal. We can also connect this directly to altitude, slope, orientation, and time. And we'll take a look at those a little bit later. First, let's connect this to our noise node, and now we can see that updating. And we can see our function node preview on each of the different axes and that overall value. We could change the origin if we wanted to see that from a little bit of a different perspective. We can zoom in and out of that. And we can also take a look at the output observer now, so we can see the actual material and what it's going to look like. And since we're actually working with a sphere, we're going to know exactly how this is going to translate onto that object. We can adjust our scale. So if we wanted to modify the overall scale of our material, which we can easily do within the main view interface or within the material editor, we can see what that's going to look like. We can also modify the origin point. So I'm going to zoom this into 0.5, and we can change our origin, and that way we can move our material and look at it from some other areas. And change those all back to 0. And we're going to set our scale to 1, which is the default. And let's take a look at the difference between our noise and fractal nodes. So if we select our noise node first, we can see we have a main bar on the left, which allows us to select the major pattern that we would like to choose from, whether it's a cellular, distributed, flat, line, math, other, Perlin, square pattern. And then with the next bar that we have, that is the subset within the main category, and that will update if we choose directly from that main category. But that allows us to just change really quickly within the main category. So I could change that to cellular chipped, but now if we want to change that to crystals, we could easily do that. Pebble noise, drought, Voronoi, altitude, and generalized. We'll change that back to chipped, and we can see this translating over. And what we can see is the white is on the right side of our color map, and the black areas of our surface are on the left side. And we don't necessarily have to work with two different colors. We could double click, and that will pull up our chooser so that we can pick through some of the different gradient maps that come with View. Let's use the canyon and click OK. And now we can see that showing up and giving us a fairly interesting looking material. We'll double click, and we can load in the green, brown, white, and now we can see that showing up. But let's go to daytime skies and select polarized blue, and we're going to have a white and a blue. But overall, the amount of detail of this noise node is not very high. If we take a look at some of our settings, we have the ability to adjust the scale of this material and this node. So we could scale that up or down. We can also adjust the wavelength, which is a way for us to stretch this out or also change its scale. So I can make it 20 on the Y, and we can see that bit of stretching showing up. We could do 10 on the X, and we can see that overall effect. I'll go ahead and zoom out a little on the scale of the overall material, or we could modify the scale itself within the noise node. We could also adjust the origin point, so if we wanted this to be a little bit more offset, we could just enter in a couple of random values there, and we could see that surface moving through our object. Go ahead and change those back to 0 and our wavelength to 1, increase our scale, and we can zoom in a little bit more in the output observer. Now let's connect this to our fractal. So we can just click on that, pull it off, and release it onto our fractal. And now I want to match up our noise pattern. So if we take a look, we can see we have cellular patterns chipped. So if we go over to our fractal, we can change that to cellular patterns chipped. And we're not really seeing a whole lot right now with this current size. So we can zoom this out a little. We can see that a little bit better. But we can tell on the bottom we have a lot more options for modifying this material. We can adjust the roughness. And right now, because of the colors we're using, we're really not seeing a whole lot of detail. So I'm going to decrease our gain, and that way we will get rid of that washed out lighter blue area. And we can increase our roughness value. And the main difference is really this roughness and also the largest and smallest feature option. Largest feature will allow us to determine basically, if we take a look at our output observer, we can see this is basically a feature that we have right here in between our darker blue, and we're determining how large that feature is going to be. So our largest feature, if we want to make that bigger, we can see that really showing up. Right now it's kind of washing it out, so we can decrease our gain, see that a little bit better. We can also do that with the smallest feature. So our smallest feature are these smaller areas in here in between our large features, so we could increase our smallest feature and decrease our largest, or we could do that the other way around. And if it's too big, of course you're not really going to see too much detail. Plus these colors really aren't going to give us a whole lot of definition. So let's go ahead and change this color map. And let's work directly with a white and a black. And now that's just a little bit easier to see. If we go back and do our simple fractal, we could increase that roughness more, and we can see a lot of that definition showing up. Change our gain, and really how much of that color we are seeing. And also keep in mind that we have a lot of different fractal node options. If we go ahead and click on the top, we can choose from a basic repeater, a simple fractal, a fast Perlin fractal, variable roughness, variable noise, 3 noise, and open ocean. And we'll take a look at those a little more in depth a little bit later. But one thing to note is if we're using a simple fractal, and if we decrease our roughness, it's basically the equivalent of working with our noise node. So if we increase our scale of our noise node, and just change these connections back and forth, we can see they're basically the same. So that added option of the largest feature and roughness is really what makes up our fractal nodes, along with, of course, all of these other settings, because once we get into that, you're really going to see all of the different detailing options and variables that we have available within fractals that just aren't available within noise nodes, because the noise node is basically just the noise itself that we would see in a fractal, except in a fractal we have the ability to modify that beyond just the actual noise setting, and it's not a completely smooth surface. And that can be a lot easier for working with especially terrains. So if you're going to be working with terrains a lot, then fractals are definitely something really good to get that nice amount of detail. And we're going to go back and delete that noise. Just select it, delete, reconnect our color to the fractal. And if you go down to the bottom where our output nodes are, and right now we're just determining the color. Let's load in a different color map. We're going to go to actually our rocks and grass, and we'll select fields and click OK. We can see that showing up. Now let's use our bump output and connect the input of that to our fractal, and we can start to see that bump showing up. So we can easily use a lot of the same nodes for modifying different outputs so that they match up correctly. And now this bump right now is really not very defined, so what we can do is just click OK and go into our bump tab, and I'm going to increase our depth to 5. Right mouse click on the bump production, go to edit function, and now we can see that a little bit better. We can go ahead and zoom back out so we can see a little bit more of that surface. What we could also do is bring that back to 1, go to our fractal, and change our wavelength to something a little bit smaller. So let's go ahead and move down the list a little bit more. I'm going to delete that connection we have to our bump, and we can see what we have underneath our fractal and noise nodes is our first node is a color map node. So let's go ahead and select that. Now the color map node is not just for creating gradients. If we go ahead and select this option, we can see we have a lot of different ways of creating and modifying color. Our color correction tab that we can see is for all of our color modifications. We can adjust the gamma, the gain, brightness, contrast, HLS shift, HLS color shift. We can set a filter, we set it up for perspective, and color blending. So we can also use these color map nodes to modify the color of each of our regular color map nodes. And if we take a look, we also have a 2-color output. And this way we can define 2 separate colors and also extract these parameters. So if we wanted to, we could actually use and set each one of these colors to be another color map node where we could set up a gradient. And then we can set up our threshold, which is basically the blend between those two colors, and even connect that to another fractal. Really a lot we can do with it. We also have the linear with the 2 output, and then a 3 color output with the same linear and spline interpolations. And of course we'll go into that more in depth later. Go ahead and delete that right now. And actually add another color map. We're going to change this to color correction. And let's just change this to HLS shift. And now what we can do is connect this bottom link from off of our original color map, connect it to the shift, and then reconnect that. And now what we can do is adjust the hue, the luminosity, and how bright our color is, and then our saturation. And we're doing this underneath our color map because we go from our input on the top, travel through our fractal, into our color map, and then we can adjust our color correction going through our color output. So these are really neat ways of modifying your surface. If you don't want to have to go in and modify the color map, because maybe you like the blend that you have or the overall shape that is caused by that color map, but you don't necessarily like the color, you just want to tweak it a little. So you could decrease the saturation a little if you needed to. And you can also extract these parameters so that way the overall changes between your hue, luminosity, or saturation can be easily extracted. And right now we can see that those parameters on the side aren't really showing up. If we just select our node, move it, then it'll refresh, and we have the ability to select all of those links. So we're going to remove that HLS shifter we added in. You can just select it and delete it. And if we move on, just underneath our color map node is our texture map node. So first thing I did was just click into our graph to get this red box, and that's going to determine where we want to add in the node. And then we could just add in that texture map node. And there's a couple of different types of texture maps. We have the regular texture map node, which is connected to UV coordinates, which give us the scale, origin, and the mapping modes as a separate parameter. And if we go into our texture map, we can adjust the image offset, interpolation type, whether it's bilinear, normalized, or bicubic, and we'll go into those actual settings a little bit later. We can also set whether or not we'd like to repeat our surface once it reaches the end, or we could have it mirror itself, or we could have it just stop completely. We can easily load in a texture map just by double-clicking on the preview, or going to this little yellow arrow that we have. And right now I just have a bunch of textures showing up from the Seamless Rock collection. And I'm just going to select one of these textures, and we can load that in as our texture map. And let's take our link from our color, go directly to that texture map, and we can see that showing up. And then if we need to change the mapping mode, we can go to our UV coordinate that we have extracted to that, and we can change the mapping mode to flat vertical, faces, cylindrical, spherical, or torical. And automatic will pick whatever it thinks is best depending on the shape of the object. If we change that to spherical, we can see it's exactly the same as the automatic mode, and that's because we're working with a sphere, so View knows that with the automatic mode it should be mapping it for a sphere type. Let's go ahead and change this to the projected texture map, and now our UV coordinates are no longer connected because we don't need them anymore. All of those settings we had with the interpolation type and the tiling modes are set in and directly connected to our projected texture map. We could also change our mapping mode. So all of those settings are now combined into one specific node that we can use rather than the regular texture map node. And we also get one extra option, which is the MIP mapping. We can set whether or not we'd like to allow MIP mapping or not. And what MIP mapping is when the camera is farther away from a surface, it will automatically downgrade it to a lower resolution texture. And that way, You don't have to worry about loading in really huge texture maps for an object that you're going to be really far away from. Of course, then the closer you move the camera in, it will refresh that texture map, and then you'll have that detail come back. So that is a really cool option that is available within the projected texture map that is not available within the regular. We also have the animation map, which is set up the exact same way as our texture map node. And if we go ahead and just scale that down so we can see the bottom options of this function, we can load in an image sequence, and then we have our UV coordinates set up. Or we could also set up for a projected animation map, and that will work the same way as our projected texture map, except that we can use an image sequence and map that directly to one of our materials. This is a really cool option that we have. We can delete that UV coordinate. We also have a blended image. We'll go ahead and pull this out. And I'm just getting a little bit of a display error, so I'll click OK. And we're going to go back into the function, and now that's reset. What we can do is take a constant color, which is currently selected, or we could replace that with another texture map and blend that with an existing texture map that we can load in. And we can also use a blended grayscale. And that way, instead of using color, we can blend this together in a grayscale fashion and remove color elements altogether. So go ahead and remove that and all of these other options that were connected. And if we move down, our next option is a filter. Go ahead and add one of those in, and we can see we have a lot of different options for filters, and we can use these between our connections of different nodes to get some really neat looking effects. We also have some environment sensitive options, which are altitude, and slope, orientation, environment, and then also patches. And we'll go into those a little bit later, and we'll start using them to modify each of our different surfaces. The constant node, which is underneath our filter, we've already kind of seen, but we have a constant color. We can also set a constant number, constant texture coordinates, value of x and y, and then a constant vector, which is going to give us both the x, y, and z axes. And we can delete that. And if we move down to our last set, we have three different options. Our first is going to be a turbulence node. Turbulence nodes are really cool. We can use them to modify a number of different nodes. If we take a look at using this with a fractal, let's go ahead and connect our color back to that color map. And if we go to our fractal and take our origin, which is going to be the second red line, now what we have is just a simple turbulence, and we can adjust the largest feature, the amplitude, and we can see that modifying our surface, and also the preview of our fractal. We can see that showing up, harmonics, and then the scaling of the overall turbulence. So that way we can get some very interesting looking surfaces, nice twisting and turning, and then this is just a simple turbulence where we have combination modes, add, blend, variable roughness, max and min values, and also a multiply. There's also a view 4 style turbulence where we can use different noise patterns to modify the overall turbulence, and also advanced turbulence, which gives us the with vortices option. Let's change this to cellular patterns chipped, increase our amplitude, and I'm going to go into our fractal and just decrease our gain a little, and we can see that a little bit better. And now we can turn with vortices on and off, and basically it's just going to add little bits of detail in various areas of our node and give us a much more complex and interesting looking turbulence. We can go ahead and delete that right now. We also want to delete that connection from our origin to the position. And our next option down is going to be the combiner nodes. Combiner nodes will give us the ability to blend together different types of color, also different noise and fractal nodes, and just give us a whole bunch of different options. If we take a look, we have a blender, a combiner, a color combiner, the ability to use add, subtract, multiply, and divide. If we change this to the blender, and let's just go ahead and change our color production with this combiner. So instead of connecting just to one fractal node to create our color, we're going to connect to two. Take our first connection, our first input of our blender, and we can connect that to our existing fractal. I'm also going to add a new fractal with a different pattern, and we'll use Perlin noise value gradient. And we take our second input and connect it to that other fractal. And now what we have is a blend between these two fractals on top, and we can adjust the ratio, whether or not we'd like to go more towards input 1 or input 2. We can also control this by using the extract parameter, and we can connect that to another node. But first, let's take a look at the combination modes. We can use add, max, min, subtract, and multiply to get various types of effects. I'm going to stick with blend right now and add in another fractal node, increase our gain, and now I'm going to connect our ratio using the parameter on the side. We can connect that directly to that new fractal, and now we have a blend between each of these two nodes that is controlled by the white and black values of this other fractal. We could also use a noise node as well. So if you wanted less detail between the blend, you could easily use that rather than a fractal. So it's very versatile in what we can do with it. And if I want, I could change our wavelength of this fractal to change that overall blend between the two surfaces. And if we go back into our blender, we can see that ratio is now a connected attribute to this fractal. And we could still change our combination modes. So we can still use the multiply, subtract, and have that overall ratio combined. But we'll go into that a little bit later with all of the different combiner node options that we have. Let's just take a look at our last node that we have on the bottom, which is our math node. And this also works similarly to the filter node, except that we don't have the ability to modify any of the different variables. With multiply, we can go and change the multiply by from 0.1 all the way up to 10. We have different conversions and vector operations, rotation and twist, which is quite cool, and we can use the edit function to modify that. But overall, a lot of those settings that are available in the math nodes are also available within filters, except within filters we have the ability to go a little bit more beyond what's available in the math node. And also we can connect filter nodes to specific links that we can't connect math nodes to. And you'll see that a little bit later, and that involves mainly the different color options that we have for our links and how we can translate that back and forth between different nodes. So now I think we can move on to actually working on a couple of different surfaces, and then we can move over to other areas of view in which we have the function editor available for modifying a lot of different things.